Hey guys, just a quick one. Last video hit over 100 comments, which is absolutely mind-blowing for this channel. Let's try that again for this video. Comment down what you think about these stories or just a hello, and the team will reply. We always reply to the comments. As always, please like and subscribe and help this channel grow. Thank you. I still can't believe how that date went so horribly wrong. I'd met this person, let's call him John, on that new dating app Hinge. We had been chatting for a couple weeks and really hitting it off. John seemed totally normal, with similar interests as me, and was super friendly over text. When we decided to finally meet up for a first date, I was feeling optimistic. We agreed to meet at a nice restaurant downtown that we both liked. I got there a few minutes early and slid into a cozy booth to wait. Soon enough, John walked in right on time and I waved him over. We exchanged a little awkward hello, and wow, you look just like your pics banter. Things were going great as we settled in and ordered dinner. The conversation flowed easily once the initial jitters wore off. I really felt like John and I were connecting. We were joking, chatting about music and movies, and just generally having a great time. About halfway through our meal, John suddenly got quiet and shifty. They kept glancing around the restaurant nervously and seemed distracted. I asked if everything was okay, and they insisted everything was fine. They just needed to use the restroom. I nodded and watched John make their way across the restaurant. I figured they probably just had some bad nerves or something. But then 10 minutes went by and John still hadn't returned. At first I thought maybe there was just a line, but once it hit the 15-minute mark with no sign of John, I started to get worried. I flagged down our waiter and asked if he had seen where my date went. He gave me a confused look and said he hadn't seen anyone come out of the bathroom in a while. Now I was really freaked out. I got up and rushed over, calling John's name. When I pushed open the door, the bathroom was completely empty. John was gone. My heart racing, I went back to our table, thinking maybe John had slipped out another exit for some reason. But all of John's belongings were still there: phone, jacket, bag. The only thing on the table was a scrap of paper tucked under John's plate. Hand shaking, I picked it up and read the message scribbled in shaky handwriting. "Get out now. You're in danger." I felt like I was going to throw up. What the hell did that mean? Was John in some kind of trouble? Were they warning me about something? None of this made any sense. The waiter came over looking concerned. I showed him the note and he immediately went to get the manager. Soon the police were called, and I had to give a statement about everything leading up to John's bizarre disappearance. But I had no answers for the increasingly urgent questions being fired at me. Where did they go? Why did they leave? What was this note about? I was just confused and freaked out as everyone else. The police searched the whole building top to bottom, but found no trace of John. They had just vanished. In the following days, I was racked with fear, anxiety, and unanswered questions. I had no idea what had happened to John. Was it some kind of emergency? Were they running from someone? Or had this all been some twisted game? John's phone went straight to voicemail every time I tried to call. Their dating profile had been deleted. It was like they had never existed. The police kept hitting dead ends, having no leads to go on. I started questioning everything John had told me about themselves. Had it all been lies? I jumped at every little sound, unable to sleep. I was terrified that whatever had happened to John was going to happen to me too. What had I gotten myself into by meeting someone from the internet? But another part of me was worried about John, hoping they were okay wherever they were. Weeks went by without any breaks in the case. My mind was spinning with unanswered questions. I knew I would never stop wondering what really happened that night. I had to know what danger that note was warning me about, and what had happened to the person I thought I was connecting with. I eventually deleted all my dating profiles, too scared to ever meet up with a stranger from the internet again. I felt like I could never trust someone new after that bizarre experience. John's disappearance would haunt me forever, the mystery never solved. Maybe one day I'd find out the truth, but for now, all I could do was replay that night over and over, analyzing every detail. I just hoped that wherever John ended up, they were safe from whatever had terrified them so much that they had to slip away without a trace and leave that cryptic warning note behind. I may never understand what happened, but I'll certainly never forget that first and last date. The weeks turned into months since that strange night, but I was no closer to making sense of it all. John's vanishing act remained a total mystery. The police had long since moved on from the case, having exhausted every lead and coming up empty. I knew I was on my own if I ever wanted answers. Part of me thought I should just try to forget the whole bizarre incident, but I couldn't let it go. I found myself compulsively scouring obscure corners of the internet looking for any clue about John's real identity or where they might have gone. I researched similar unexplained disappearances, wondering if there was some connection. My fixation was bordering on unhealthy, but I couldn't stop. This mystery had its hooks in me. I had to know why this person I had been so compatible with online had set off every alarm bell in real life. So I kept digging, following each new thread down the rabbit hole. I signed up for access to databases of public records, trying to piece together a fuller picture of who John really was. Of course, most of the information they'd given me was untraceable or flat-out fabricated, but there had to be something real. The deeper I looked, the more questions I had. It seemed John had gone to great lengths to erase their digital footprint prior to our meeting, almost like they knew they'd be vanishing without a trace. Had this all been part of some elaborate plan? I started noticing strange patterns the more I uncovered. John wasn't the only one with a hidden past. Other dates who had disappeared mysteriously had eerily similar backgrounds. It was almost like they were connected. But how? No one else seemed to have made the connections I was starting to see. I tried going to the police again, but they told me to move on with my life. I knew I was on my own if I wanted to get to the bottom of this. I should have known better. When Tom messaged me on the dating app, everything seemed normal at first. He was cute, seemed nice, and we had a lot in common based on our profiles. We chatted for a while and decided to meet up for drinks. I was a little nervous, as first dates always make me anxious, but I tried to push those feelings aside and just focus on getting to know him. We met at a bar downtown where I'd been to a few times before and felt comfortable in. I got there a few minutes early and grabbed us a table in the corner. When Tom arrived, he greeted me with a warm smile and we made small talk as we looked over the drink menu. I ordered a glass of red wine, my usual first date order, and he got a beer. Everything seemed to be going well at first. Tom was easy to talk to, and we found ourselves laughing and sharing stories about our jobs, our families, our hobbies. I was starting to relax and actually enjoy myself. But then, about halfway through my wine, I noticed a strange, slightly bitter aftertaste. I took another sip, trying to pinpoint what was off about it. Suddenly, I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. My vision blurred and the room started spinning. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady myself, but the disorientation was overwhelming. My heart started racing as a sinking feeling of dread settled in the pit of my stomach. I think Tom must have noticed a change in my demeanor, because he leaned in with a look of concern on his face. I'm not sure, I stammered, my voice shaky. I think there's something wrong with my drink. Tom's brow furrowed with concern, and he reached across the table to take the glass from my hand. He brought it to his nose and took a sniff. Then his eyes went wide with what looked like panic. "We need to get you out of here," his expression seemed to say urgently as he stood up and offered me his hand. I didn't have the energy to argue. I just let him help me to my feet, my legs feeling like jelly beneath me. As we hurried towards the exit, the world around me seemed to be moving in slow motion. I could feel my consciousness slipping away, and I knew I had to get help fast before I passed out completely. Somehow we made it outside. The cool night air hit my face, providing a brief moment of clarity. Tom kept a firm grip on my arm, guiding me down the street. I could tell he was trying to remain calm, but the panic was evident as he looked at me and mouthed words, asking if I knew where my car was parked. I shook my head, racking my brain to remember where I had left it. But everything was a blur. I couldn't even recall how I had gotten to the bar in the first place. Tom nodded reassuringly, though his eyes betrayed his worry. He pulled out his phone with his free hand and started tapping away. I wanted to tell him that I didn't think I could make it much further, that I was fading fast, but the words wouldn't come. I could feel myself slipping in and out of consciousness, my legs growing heavier with each step. Somehow, we made it to the curb just as the Uber arrived. Tom helped me into the back seat, then climbed in beside me. I leaned my head back against the seat, fighting to keep my eyes open. The driver glanced at us in the rearview mirror, a concerned look on his face. Tom said something to him, gesturing towards me urgently. The driver's eyes widened as he seemed to understand the severity of the situation. He didn't hesitate, immediately pulling out into traffic and speeding off. I could vaguely make out Tom speaking rapidly into his phone, though the words were muffled and indistinct. I don't know how long the drive took, but it felt like an eternity. By the time we pulled up to the emergency room entrance, I was barely conscious. Tom practically carried me inside, waving his arms wildly to get help. The next thing I remember is waking up in a hospital bed, an IV in my arm, and a nurse checking my vitals. Tom was sitting in a chair beside me, looking relieved to see me open my eyes. I gave him a questioning look, still confused about what had happened. He grimly explained with hand gestures and a serious expression that I had apparently been drugged at the bar. I could tell he felt guilty, as if he should have noticed something was wrong sooner. I shook my head weakly, trying to indicate that it wasn't his fault. The nurse stepped in then, asking me a series of questions about what I remembered. I mimed drinking from a glass and pointed to my head, then made a dizzy gesture to convey the strange taste and disorientation. She nodded grimly, making a writing motion to signify she understood. She then pretended to look at test results, nodding and giving me a thumbs up to indicate they had confirmed the presence of a date rape drug. I felt sick both from the lingering effects of the drug and the realization of what could have happened if Tom hadn't been there. I shuddered at the thought of what that man might have done if I had lost consciousness completely. The nurse patted my arm reassuringly, seemingly explaining that the drug was leaving my system and it would recover fully. But the emotional trauma would take longer to heal. As I lay there, Tom reached out and gave my hand a gentle squeeze. His eyes were full of relief and concern, conveying without words how glad he was that I was okay. I could tell he'd have been really worried about me. I managed a weak smile, squeezing his hand back gratefully. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude towards this stranger who had quite literally saved me from a horrific fate. It was a sobering reminder that not everyone on dating apps is dangerous. Sometimes there are genuine good people out there, willing to step up and help when you need it most. And I'm so thankful that on a night that could have ended tragically, I found one of the good ones. The chime from my phone startled me out of my daze. I had been mindlessly swiping on that dating app for who knows how long, barely paying attention to the faces flashing across the screen. With a sigh, I clicked over to my messages. A new one had popped up from a user named Sean. I skimmed through their profile. Attractive, seemed normal enough, had a good job. Figuring I had nothing to lose, I responded, and we started chatting. Sean was easy to talk to over text. The conversation flowed smoothly, and they actually seemed interested in what I had to say. After a week of increasingly flirty messages, Sean finally asked if I wanted to meet up for coffee. I hesitated. Something about it felt a bit off, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. I was tempted to make up an excuse to avoid meeting in person, but my painfully empty social calendar ultimately made the decision for me. I agreed to the date. The morning of, I stood in front of the mirror, fussing with my hair, replaying our conversations in my head. Were there any red flags I had missed? Try as I might, I couldn't pinpoint anything too concerning. With a sigh, I grabbed my things and headed out, nerves churning in my stomach. The cafe Sean had picked was cozy, filled with overstuffed armchairs and mahogany tables. I got there early and chose a table in the corner where I could watch the door. My leg bounced with anxious energy as I waited, eyes darting around the room. Finally, Sean walked in, scanning the room until their eyes landed on me. I raised my hand in an awkward wave. They smiled and made their way over. Up close, they looked just like their pictures, stylishly dressed with warm brown eyes. We exchanged slightly stiff pleasantries as they sat down across from me. An uncomfortable silence descended briefly before we both started gesturing at once. We laughed, breaking the tension. The conversation started out a bit stilted, but soon loosened up. Sean was charming in person, asking thoughtful questions and making me laugh with funny stories. My nerves began to dissipate as we lost track of time, the coffee growing cold on the table. I was surprised to realize I was actually enjoying myself. All too soon, the barista was pointedly sweeping nearby, the cafe emptying out around us. We reluctantly gathered our things, not quite ready for the day to end. As we stepped outside into the crisp evening air, Sean turned to me with a hopeful expression. They mimed taking a drink as if to invite me back to their place. I hesitated, alarm bells faintly ringing in the back of my mind. But the date had gone so well, and I didn't have any real reason to decline. I pushed my doubts away, blaming them on my usual paranoia, so I nodded in agreement. Sean's smile widened, and they led the way to their car. The drive was short, filled with more of the lively discussion from the cafe, though without words. I felt my guard lowering more and more as the surroundings grew increasingly upscale. Maybe Sean actually had their life as together as they claimed. We pulled up to a sleek high-rise building. Sean led me inside to their apartment on one of the top floors. It was modern but cozy, with plush furniture and city views. They gave me a quick tour before pouring us both a glass of wine. We settled onto the couch in the living room, the conversation flowing freely once more, though still silently. I was right in the middle of a story when a sudden banging on the front door made me jump, wine sloshing over the rim of my glass. Sean looked just as startled, meeting my eyes with confusion. The banging came again, louder, accompanied by muffled yelling that was still indistinguishable. Sean set their glass down and crept toward the door, peering cautiously through the peephole. Their face went pale, and they turned back to me, mouthing it's my ex. Dread flooded my body as the reality of the situation hit me. The banging continued, punctuated by shouting I could now make out, though I still could not understand the words. Sean began pacing, whispering under their breath as they wrung their hands. I sat frozen on the couch, mind racing through potential scenarios, each worse than the last. The door rattled violently on its hinges as the person on the other side slammed into it. Sean's eyes were wild, their breathing rapid and shallow. They mouthed to me that they didn't know what to do. I could only stare back helplessly, feeling the blood drain from my face. With a final massive bang, the door burst open. A disheveled figure stumbled into the room, eyes landing on me. Sean's ex. They looked deranged, hair sticking up at odd angles, clothes rumpled and stained. Their eyes were bloodshot, hands balled into fists. I shrank back into the couch, raising my hands instinctively. The ex paid me no mind, focusing their rage on Sean, who stood frozen nearby. The ex was shouting angrily, spittle flying from their mouth. They advanced toward Sean, who snapped out of their stupor and grabbed the ex's flailing arms. The two struggled, knocking over a lamp that shattered on the ground. I watched in horror, unable to move or look away. With a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength, Sean managed to shove their ex back hard. The ex tripped over the fallen lamp and crashed to the floor, striking their head on the sharp edge of the coffee table on the way down. They immediately went still, eyes closed. Sean and I stared at each other in shock, both struggling to process what had just transpired. Moving slowly, as if in a dream, I got up from the couch and made my way over to the ex's motionless form. I reached out a trembling hand to check for a pulse. Nothing. My heart stuttered as I looked up at Sean's stricken face. I mouthed that I thought the ex was dead. I should have known something was off from the moment I stepped into Tom's apartment for our first date. The place was immaculate, not a single item out of place or speck of dust to be seen. It felt sterile, like a model home or furniture showroom. Definitely not a lived-in space. As I walked further inside, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The minimalist decor and lack of any personal effects made the apartment feel cold and uninviting. Even the air seemed stale, as if the windows were never opened. I brushed away my unease, telling myself I was just being paranoid. After all, Tom and I had really hit it off chatting online over the past few weeks. He seemed totally normal, a bit quirky maybe, but nice enough. I was just nervous since this was our first time meeting in person after matching on that dating app. Tom emerged from the kitchen holding 2 glasses of wine. He seemed nervous too, fidgeting and avoiding eye contact. As we settled onto his stark white couch, an uncomfortable silence descended. I racked my brain for something to say to break the tension. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something that made my stomach drop, a tiny camera, partially obscured behind a vase on the end table. I quickly averted my gaze, not wanting to let on that I'd seen it. My pulse pounded in my ears as I subtly scanned the room, heart sinking as I spotted another camera tucked high in the corner where the wall met the ceiling. I desperately tried to act casual, making small talk about the weather and sipping my wine as my mind raced. How could I get out of there without raising Tom's suspicions? I didn't want to spook him and risk setting him off. God only knew what he might do if he realized I was onto him and his sick hidden camera setup. I considered pretending I had gotten an urgent call or text from a family member needing help. But I knew I had to be strategic and not make any sudden moves toward the door. I slowly steered the conversation toward the idea of leaving, making some innocuous comment about having an early morning the next day. But Tom's expression darkened at the mention of me departing, his voice taking on a sinister edge as he insisted I stay longer. I stood quickly, mumbling some excuse about needing to get home, and made for the door on shaky legs. I could feel his eyes boring into me as I fumbled to unlock the door and hurry out into the hall, not looking back until I was safe inside my car. The entire drive home, I kept checking the rearview mirror, irrationally certain that Tom would appear behind me at any moment. My mind reeled. Had I really just been on a date with some kind of voyeur? The very thought made my skin crawl. I knew I should call the police, but I was far too shaken to think clearly. I just wanted to get home and lock the door behind me. Over the next few days, I became increasingly paranoid, jumping at every little sound. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even in my own home. I started closing the blinds and curtains, even though it made the apartment feel darker and more confined. At night, I double and triple checked that the door was locked before allowing myself to sleep. But every creak and pop from the old building made me imagine Tom lurking right outside. What could I really tell the police? That I'd been on one date with a guy who had hidden cameras. They'd probably just dismiss me as crazy, and I had no proof beyond my own vague recollections. Still, the thought of Tom watching and recording women without their consent made my blood boil. He could be preying on countless other dating app matches who had no idea what a monster he was. I agonized over what to do. Weeks passed and months, but I never fully shed the sense of unease that had settled over me. I found myself scrutinizing every person who walked past me on the street, watching for any sign I was being followed or monitored. Out running errands, my eyes would dart around, searching for hidden cameras lurking in corners. At the grocery store or the bank, even just pumping gas, nowhere felt safe anymore. I considered moving and getting a new phone number, wiping my online presence clean. But some rational part of me understood I couldn't keep living like this, in a constant state of fear and paranoia. Tom was just one guy, sick and dangerous, yes, but unlikely to be lurking around every corner. At some point, I needed to start trusting people again in order to move on with any semblance of a normal life. So gradually, incrementally, I started testing the waters, agreeing to meet a girlfriend for coffee, attending a work happy hour, even signing up on a different dating site using an alias. Each small act of openness felt like a minor triumph, even if I was still hyper-vigilant about watching for red flags. With time, I found myself laughing more easily, feeling lighter and less guarded. I know I'll never forget that chilling experience with Tom. It left me with emotional scars that may never fully heal, but I'm determined not to let it rule the rest of my life. What happened wasn't my fault. He was clearly unwell and took advantage of my trust. And while my instincts that night may have saved me from something far worse, I know now I can't assume the worst of every person I meet. I'm still cautious, but trying not to harden my heart completely. Opening ourselves up always involves some risk. But the alternative, a life of constant fear and isolation, is far worse. What matters is learning from our past experiences while still finding the courage to take that leap of faith again. I had always been wary of online dating, unsure if meeting strangers from the internet was really the best way to find a meaningful connection. But after a recent breakup left me single again, my friends convinced me I had to get back out there. They said all the cool kids were using dating apps these days. It was just the modern way to meet people, they claimed. Though hesitant, I finally caved to the peer pressure and downloaded the latest trendy dating app. After spending way too long agonizing over the perfect profile pics and witty bio, I officially created an account. Those first few days were spent endlessly swiping through an endless sea of faces, trying to determine someone's compatibility from a handful of photos and a short prompt. It all felt so superficial, but to my surprise, I eventually matched with a guy named Trevor. He seemed nice enough from our initial messages, friendly, conversational, and thoughtful. When he asked if I'd be interested in meeting up for drinks, I decided to take the leap outside my comfort zone. It was time to give this online dating thing a real shot. We had plans to meet at a trendy new bar downtown that I had heard about but never been to. I arrived early wanting to scope out the scene and slid into a corner booth to wait. As the minutes ticked by, I could feel my nerves building. What if this guy was totally normal online but a complete creep in real life? As irrational as it seemed, my mind raced with worst-case scenarios. I bounced my leg anxiously under the table and picked at my nails, bad habits when I'm stressed. Just when I was about to lose my cool, I looked up and saw Trevor entering the bar. He scanned the room until he made eye contact with me and flashed a warm, dimpled smile. I waved him over, relieved to see he looked as handsome and charming as his photo suggested. Trevor slid into the seat across from me and launched right into easy conversation. We covered all the basics: jobs, family, pop culture, hobbies. I was impressed by how thoughtful and engaged he seemed. The conversation flowed naturally without any awkward pauses. I found myself relaxing and thinking maybe this online dating thing wasn't so scary after all. After about an hour of steady chatting, our waitress swung by to check on us. She asked if we wanted another round of drinks. Trevor handed her his empty glass and said a refill would be great. When she turned to me, I politely waved her off, explaining I was still nursing my first cocktail and was doing okay for now. Suddenly, Trevor's entire demeanor changed. He slammed his fist down forcefully on the table, rattling the glasses and startling me. I flinched back, confused by his intense reaction. Trevor's face was contorted in anger, his eyes blazing. In a biting tone, he snapped at me for not wanting another drink, demanding to know what my problem was. I stammered, struggling to respond coherently while my heart raced. I tried to explain I was just pacing myself, but he cut me off. Trevor accused me of thinking he was trying to get me drunk and take advantage of me. His voice got increasingly louder, causing people at nearby tables to stop their conversations and stare over at the commotion. I felt my cheeks flush hot with embarrassment. This was definitely not the type of first date scene I had hoped for. I quietly urged Trevor to lower his voice, hoping to diffuse the situation before it got any worse. But it was no use. He was completely irate at this point. Trevor shouted that he was sick of arrogant girls like me judging him unfairly and assuming the worst. I tried to interject that he had misunderstood, but he barreled right over me. He called me presumptuous and said I must think I'm too good for a guy like him. I was stunned, unable to comprehend how he could spew such vitriol at someone he'd just met. I certainly didn't think I was better than him. I barely knew him. When Trevor abruptly stood up, knocking his chair over backwards with a loud clatter, I felt a swell of fear. He towered over me, fists clenched, as he continued his tirade. I cowered back into the corner of the booth, terrified by his aggressive posturing. Before things could escalate any further, the bartender quickly made his way over. In a firm tone, he told Trevor he needed to leave immediately. Trevor growled in frustration, but ultimately stormed towards the exit without further incident. The bartender came over to check on me, asking kindly how I wanted a cab called. I shook my head, still feeling dazed and confused about what had just transpired. I gathered my belongings, paid my tab, and hurried out of the bar, wanting to put as much distance as I could between myself and Trevor. As I drove home, my mind raced to make sense of it all. Where did that violent rage come from? One minute we were having pleasant, light-hearted conversation. The next, Trevor completely snapped over something so trivial. It was clear he had some unchecked anger issues bubbling just under the surface, ready to boil over at the slightest perceived slight. I shuddered to think what could have happened if we were alone and that bartender hadn't intervened. When I got back to my apartment, I immediately deleted my dating app profile. I was done trying to meet men that way. It was just too unpredictable and risky, as I had learned the hard way. I spent the rest of the night on edge, triple-checking that my door was locked. At every little sound, I jumped, irrationally half expecting an enraged Trevor to show up. Over the next few days, I remained anxious and on high alert, the traumatic experience still fresh. When friends asked how my big date went, I gave vague, evasive answers, not ready to relive the chilling incident by rehashing the details. About a week later, when I finally started to feel a bit more like myself again, I decided to try to report Trevor's profile to the dating site for threatening behavior. I wanted to make sure, if possible, that what happened to me didn't happen to some other unsuspecting woman. In the end, I never heard back from the dating site, and I never saw or heard from Trevor again. I like to think he got professional help for his explosive anger issues. But realistically, he is likely still out there, ready to unleash that rage onto the next unlucky girl at the slightest provocation. The whole ill-fated date was an eye-opening experience for me. It left me feeling much warier about meeting strangers from the internet and less trusting of people in general. I'm thankful I got out of that bar unharmed, but it's not an evening I will ever forget. I should have known something was off from the start. When I matched with George on that dating app, it seemed too good to be true. Tall, dark, and handsome, with a great job and an adorable dog. It was like they were straight out of a romance novel, but I figured I'd give it a shot. What did I have to lose? Our first date was perfect. We met up at this cute little cafe downtown, and the conversation flowed so easily. We talked for hours, laughing and getting to know each other. George told me all about their job as an architect, how they loved the creativity and problem-solving involved. They showed me pictures of their black lab, Max, who they adopted from the local shelter last year. I told George about my work as a teacher and how I enjoy helping shape young minds. We discovered we both loved hiking and camping and made plans to go on a trip together someday. By the end of the night, I was smitten. George was charming, intelligent, and had the most mesmerizing green eyes. When they walked me to my car, I felt butterflies in my stomach. I couldn't wait to see them again. We went on a few more dates over the next couple of weeks, and things just kept getting better. George took me to the nicest restaurants in town, and always had a little gift waiting for me at the end of each night. They listened intently when I talked about my family or my dreams for the future. I started to let my guard down to really believe this could be something real. Then, out of nowhere, they disappeared. No warning, no explanation. George just stopped responding to my texts and calls. I was devastated. Had I done something wrong? Was there someone else? I racked my brain, trying to figure out what happened. A few days later, I was out running errands when I thought I caught a glimpse of George in the crowd. My heart raced as I tried to get a better look, but they were gone before I could be sure. I shrugged it off, convincing myself I was just seeing things. But then it happened again, and again. Everywhere I went, I think I saw George, lurking in the shadows or blending into the background. One time I could have sworn I saw their shiny black BMW parked outside my gym. Another time it looked like they were sitting alone 2 tables away from me at a restaurant. It was unsettling, to say the least. The final straw came when I started getting strange messages. At first, they were just vague, innocuous things like "I miss you" or "wish we could talk." But they quickly escalated into something much more sinister when they started saying things like, "I know your schedule. I saw you at the gym today. You look beautiful when you sleep." I was terrified. Who was doing this, and how did they know so much about me? I tried to convince myself it was all just a sick joke, but deep down I knew. It had to be George. I reported the messages to the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do without more evidence. In the meantime, I was on high alert, constantly looking over my shoulder and jumping at every little noise. I started carrying pepper spray in my purse, and I even got a taser to keep by my bed. I was afraid to leave my apartment alone. The worst part was the uncertainty. I had no idea what George was capable of or how far they were willing to go. Were they just trying to scare me, or was this the beginning of something much more sinister? I couldn't sleep, I could barely eat, and I was constantly on edge. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a strange scraping sound outside my window. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly pulled back the curtain, peering out cautiously. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I noticed something carved into the tree below my window. It was a heart with my initials and George's carved inside. They had been here. I quickly closed the curtains, my hands shaking. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, George was long gone. The officer said there was nothing more they could do without evidence of a direct threat. But I knew this was only going to get worse. After that, the messages and the sightings only escalated. Strange gifts started showing up on my doorstep. Flowers, love notes, my favorite candy. I stopped going out alone, worried I would run into George around every corner. I felt like I was being watched 24/7, and I was terrified of what they might do next. One day, I came home to find my apartment completely ransacked. My clothes were ripped from the closets, my paperwork strewn across the floor. The only thing missing was my diary, full of intimate details about my life. Now George knew everything. I knew I had to take action before things went any further. I started taking self-defense classes, and I made sure to vary my routine so George couldn't track me so easily. I even considered moving, but I didn't want to disrupt my life even more. This was my home, and I refused to be driven out. Late one night, I arrived home to find George sitting on my doorstep waiting for me. Without hesitation, I pulled out my mace and sprayed them right in the eyes. They screamed in pain, and I used the opportunity to race inside and lock the door. I immediately called the police, but George was already gone by the time they got there. Finally, I had proof George was escalating things. The police helped me file for a restraining order right away. I also upgraded my security system and made sure all of my friends knew to be on alert for any sign of George. I was still constantly looking over my shoulder, but I felt empowered knowing I stood up for myself. It's been a few months now, and thankfully George seems to have moved on and left me alone. The messages and sightings have stopped completely. I still get anxious going out in public, worried I might run into those familiar green eyes. My friends help me stay vigilant just in case George ever decides to come back, but I'm not going to live in fear anymore. I've learned to trust my instincts and protect myself. I know now that things are not always as perfect as they seem at first, but I'm stronger for having gone through this ordeal. I won't let one unstable person steal my joy. The best revenge is living life to the fullest. And I will never, ever use a dating app again. My own company is all I need. I had such high hopes when Mark first asked me out. We had met at a mutual friend's party, and I was instantly drawn to his warm smile and easygoing charm. When he suggested dinner and a movie for our first date, I readily agreed, already picturing the possibilities for a budding romance. Little did I know I was walking into that fateful night. The first hint of trouble came when Mark picked me up to drive to the restaurant. As I slid into the passenger seat, I noticed a faint but distinctive perfume scent in the air. It was floral and feminine, definitely not a fragrance Mark would wear. When I asked about it, he hastily explained that he had borrowed his sister's car for our date. I let slide, not wanting to ruin the night with suspicions. At dinner, conversation flowed smoothly between us as we shared childhood stories and discovered common interests. Mark was attentive and engaging, focused entirely on me in a way that felt sincere. By the time we left the restaurant, I was thoroughly charmed and very much looking forward to seeing where things went. We decided to head back to Mark's place to watch the movie, since he had a brand new flat-screen TV he wanted to show off. I didn't think twice about going over, swept up in the promising first date. As soon as we walked inside, though, I noticed something amiss. There was a vase of fresh flowers on the kitchen counter in varying shades of pink. They looked lovely, but also out of place in a bachelor pad. When I made a comment about them, Mark shifted awkwardly and mumbled something about his sister surprising him with the arrangement. Again, I let slide, not wanting to make a big deal on a first date. Things took a more ominous turn when I asked to use the restroom. As I was washing my hands, I spotted a prescription bottle on the counter made out to a woman named Shelley. This gave me pause, but I reminded myself people keep old prescriptions sometimes. I rejoined Mark in the living room, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling slowly growing within me. About halfway through the movie, nature called once more. This time when I used the restroom, I snooped a little, opening the medicine cabinet. There, lined up neatly, were 3 different prescriptions, all for Shelley. My heart started to pound. Was Shelley a roommate? An ex-girlfriend? Why hadn't Mark mentioned he lived with someone? I was working up the nerve to confront Mark about my discoveries when I heard a thud come from down the hall, like a door softly closing. I froze, listening intently. "Did you hear that?" I asked Mark. He looked at me blankly, shaking his head. I laughed it off with a comment about old houses making noises, but I knew I wasn't imagining things. Trying to stay calm, I went to refill my drink in the kitchen. As I did, I noticed a piece of mail on the counter addressed to Shelley, the same address. I took a deep breath, realizing I had to get to the bottom of this. "Mark, who is Shelley?" I asked directly. "Does she live here with you?" Mark's reaction told me everything I needed to know. He blanched, stammering and stuttering, unable to meet my eyes. I didn't wait for an explanation. I set down my drink and marched towards the hallway, determined to figure out what was going on. The first door I tried was a linen closet neatly stacked with towels and bedding. The very next door revealed what Mark had been hiding. There, sitting on the bed in a robe, was a woman I presumed to be Shelley, She looked up at me in shock, eyes wide and frightened. "You must be Sarah," she finally said softly. "Mark told me all about you." In that instant, I understood. Mark hadn't mentioned Shelley because Shelley was still his girlfriend. For whatever twisted reason, he had started dating me behind her back. I was the other woman, unknowingly roped into his web of lies. I backed away, feeling sick with anger and disgust. How could I have been so foolish, ignoring all the signs? Mark stood in the hallway, pleading with me to let him explain. But I had heard enough. I grabbed my purse and strode to the front door, with Mark begging me not to leave. As I wrenched open the door, I came face to face with a man standing on the front step, poised to knock. He introduced himself as Shelley's brother, Dave. Before I could process this new development, Shelley came racing down the hall, yelling for Dave. In hurried explanation, Shelley revealed that she had texted her brother for help after overhearing Mark's plans for our date. Dave's eyes blazed with fury as the sordid tale unfolded. Though I was still in shock, I knew I had to flee this powder keg situation before things turned even uglier. I pushed past Dave and ran to my car, ignoring Mark calling my name. I drove around in a daze for hours, shaken to my core by the night's events. My mind reeled at Mark's capacity for dishonesty and manipulation. I could only imagine what Shelley was going through, discovering her boyfriend's betrayal in such a traumatic way. And poor Dave, I hoped he was able to provide some comfort to his distraught sister. As for me, I resolved to be much more cautious and discerning of getting to know men in the future. I would never ignore red flags again or give some the benefit of the doubt prematurely. Though my trust was shattered, I was fortunate to uncover Mark's deceit early on, before I was in too deep. My heart went out to Shelley, who was likely still picking up the pieces. I could only hope we both emerged wiser and learned from this painful experience. For now, I wanted to put as much distance as I could between me and that disastrous date. I should have known something was off about him from the start. When I matched with him on the dating app, his profile seemed normal enough at first glance. A few generic photos showing him doing normal activities like hiking and hanging out with friends. A short bio listing basic interests like sports, movies, and traveling. Nothing too unusual for a dating profile. But when we started messaging, there was just something about his tone that immediately rubbed me the wrong way. His messages were overly familiar, like we were already close friends rather than total strangers. He asked very personal questions right off the bat, wanting to know my exact address so he could pick me up properly for our date. When I politely declined to share that level of detail so soon, he brushed it off like it was no big deal. Still, I tried to keep an open mind. Maybe he was just a little socially awkward and coming on too strong. I figured one quick drink wouldn't hurt, just to give him a chance. We agreed to meet at a bar downtown that I picked out, a public place I knew well, where I felt safe. When we met outside the bar, I immediately noticed him staring at my car with an odd intensity. I caught his gaze lingering on my license plate for just a beat too long before he turned to greet me with an over-enthusiastic hug. Again, my instincts told me something was off, but I ignored the uneasiness creeping down my spine. We sat at the bar and made small talk over drinks. On the surface, he seemed pleasant enough, if a bit cloying. He was very complimentary and kept finding little excuses to touch my shoulder or brush his leg against mine. But he also seemed oddly distracted at times, his eyes constantly scanning the room behind me. The more we talked, the more it felt like he was playing a role rather than genuinely connecting. When it came time to leave, I hesitated before accepting his offer to walk me to my car. As we walked through the darkened parking lot, he stayed uncomfortably close, his hand hovering near the small of my back. I slid away from him and picked up my pace, now fully eager to end this strange encounter. At my car, he lingered, clearly angling for a kiss goodnight. I dodged his attempt and quickly thanked him for the drinks before getting into my car and locking the doors. I could see him staring after me as I pulled out of the parking lot, watching until my taillights disappeared down the road. The entire drive home, I couldn't shake the weird vibes from the date. His odd behavior kept nagging at me, like a voice in my head telling me to stay alert. Still, I tried telling myself I was overthinking things. He was probably just lonely and bad at social cues. But when I pulled into my driveway and saw the front door was ajar, my heart started pounding. I knew in my gut something was very wrong. I got out of the car cautiously, looking around for any signs of an intruder. The neighborhood was dark and quiet. Gripping my keys tightly, I crept up to the door and nudged it open. The entryway was pitch black inside. I felt along the wall for the light switch, my breaths shallow and shaky. As the lights flickered on, I could see the living room was in complete disarray. Drawers emptied onto the floor, cushions tossed everywhere. Someone had clearly ransacked the place. I pulled out my phone to call the police, but hesitated. What if the intruder was still here? I couldn't risk making any noise to alert them. Heart pounding, I slowly moved through the downstairs, checking each room, but there was no sign of anyone. Mustering my courage, I crept up the stairs, wincing as each step creaked under my weight. I paused at the top, listening intently for any sound. That's when I noticed the faint glow of light coming from the cracked door of my bedroom. My adrenaline spiked, and I had to resist the urge to run back outside. Gripping my keys so tightly they dug into my palm, I tiptoed down the hall. Through the bedroom door, I could see the room was completely destroyed, my clothes, jewelry, everything strewn across the floor. Before I could process the violation of this invasion, a floorboard creaked behind me. I whirled around and came face to face with a man from the bar, his eyes wild and lips curled into a sinister grin. Shock and fear coursed through me as the pieces fell into place. This had all been a setup. We stared at each other for a split second that felt like an eternity. Without thinking, I reared back and slashed at his face with my keys. He let out a pained yell as I sprinted past him, bounding down the stairs and out the front door. I ran to my car, glancing back to see him silhouetted in the doorway, watching me flee. Hand shaking, I jammed the keys in the ignition and sped off into the night, my heart feeling like it would beat out of my chest. I drove for miles before pulling over and calling the cops in tears. The police came and searched the house, but found no sign of him inside. They took my statement and tried to reassure me that he was likely just a confused drunk who wandered in thinking it was his place. But I knew that was far from the truth. This had been planned, and now he knew where I lived, what my car looked like, details about my life. Over the next few weeks, I hardly slept, jumping at every little sound. I got new locks, a security system, anything to try to feel safe again. But I still couldn't shake the lingering fear that he was out there, watching and waiting for his next opportunity. That twisted grin of his haunted my nightmares. I eventually moved out of that house, needing to feel like I had a fresh start somewhere new. My dating app profile stayed deleted, too anxious to put myself out there again. I wondered if I would ever truly feel safe, or if this experience had damaged my ability to trust for good. In many ways, I did feel like a victim after that night, but I also found an inner strength I didn't know I had. And I learned to listen to my instincts instead of ignoring the warning signs. Though I hoped our paths would never cross again, I knew that if they did, this time I would be ready.